dear students, at times language contact can lead to devastating results, and we can have language endangerment, attrition, and even death as a result of language contact. The term language shift was first used by Uriel van Rijk to denote the change from the habitual use of one language to that of another. The terms maintenance and shift were consolidated in a pioneering article by Joshua Fishman in 1964. So what do we mean when we say we use the terms language maintenance, shift, language death, language attrition, etc.? We'll see now. Language maintenance, it denotes the continuing use of a language in the face of competition from a regionally and socially more powerful language. Language shift, it denotes the replacement of one language by another as the primary means of communication and socialization within a community. So language shift often involves the progressive redistribution of the languages over first public and formal domains and then informal and home domain, with the home religion, folk songs, and tales usually being the last bastions of survival for the dominated language. Some examples of language shift could be shift from Gaelic to English in northeast Scotland, and Susan Gill's 1979 study that I discussed with you before, where we discussed shift from Hungarian to German in a community in Oberwart, Austria. Language shift can be followed by language death, as was the case with Carnovik. Carnovik language, that was the main language of Cornwall in England. So the shift from Carnovik to English in the 18th century happened. It became extinct as first language in Cornwall in the late 18th century. Now in early 20th century, a revival began. It is described as an essential part of Carnovik identity, culture, and heritage. We can also have language shift without language death, as in the case of Norwegian in USA. The Norwegian speakers in USA, they shifted from Norwegian to English, but Norwegian is not a dead language. It is being spoken and it is a thriving language in Norway. There can also be cases where you have language death without shift. What happened with the Tasmanian languages following the invasion and colonization by the Britishers and a genocide that took place. Now there are a lot of efforts by Aboriginal people who survived the genocide and linguists. They have been working to preserve and restore some of the country's, Australia's, that is, original languages. In this wider context of language preservation and renewal, a reconstructed Tasmanian Aboriginal language has recently emerged, and its name is Palawa Kani. That is, Tasmanian or Aboriginal people speak. And it is based on surviving spoken and written remnants of the island's original languages. The term language death is used when that community is the last one in the world to use that language, and with the last speaker, the death of the last speaker, the language also dies. When large number of speakers shift from their native language to another language, it is called language attrition. Language attrition and shift can lead to language endangerment and death. So, when do we call a language endangered? An endangered language is one that is likely to become extinct in the near future. Many languages are falling out of use and being replaced by others that are more widely used in the region or nation, such as English in the US or Spanish in Mexico. Unless current trends are reversed, these endangered languages will become extinct within the next century. Many other languages are no longer being learned by new generations of children or by new adult speakers. These languages will become extinct when their last speaker dies. In fact, dozens of languages today have only one native speaker still living, and last person's death will mean the extinction of the language. It will no longer be spoken or known by anyone. When a language no longer has fluent native speakers, it starts getting endangered. It is not passed on to next generation. That leads to shrinking of domains of language usage as the number of speakers lessens. In some time, the language can become extinct if it is not revived by reversing the trends. So you understand, intergenerational transfer is very important to keep a language alive. And if intergenerational transfer of language is not taking place, then gradually language is born to shrink and also become so endangered that it might become extinct in some time, in a few generations. So, what are the reasons of language shift? So, some of the reasons are stated here. So, first reason could be displacement of the native population from the ancestral land. So, that is one of the reasons why the tribal languages are losing out fast, as due to various projects, economic activities, and other pressures of the modern world. Their lands, forests, and natural habitats are taken over by the civilized world. They are either displaced or forced to migrate, thus, the loss of natural habitat, traditional livelihoods, and way of life leads to gradual loss and shift to other languages. For example, displacement of Akta hunter-gatherers of Dimasalan of Philippines for developmental projects. Other reason can be encroachment or invasion on the land, habitat, and source of livelihood of the indigenous population. As we can see in a large number of cases involving indigenous languages in Australia and the Americas, the causes of shift and death are clear. Once viable and autonomous speech communities were either destroyed or deprived of their traditional land and resettled with other groups who did not always share the same language. Eventually, reorientation to a new westernized society further weakened traditional forms of the surviving languages among the young. So, encroachment or invasion of land, habitat, and source of livelihood of the indigenous population can lead to language shift and even death. Apart from displacement, there are other factors that lead to language endangerment. They are economic changes, status, demography, institutional support. Now we will discuss them in some detail. Economic factors. Economic changes are by far the most salient of the factors leading to shift. Though the relation is neither necessary nor sufficient, the juxtaposition of different speech communities is frequently brought about by invasion, seeking of refuge, immigration of workers, or trade. All of these, except perhaps for some instances of refuge, have an underlying economic motive. In many countries, modernization, industrialization, and urbanization often lead to bilingualism in a vernacular language and a more widespread regional language associated with the economy. For example, with respect to Scottish Gaelic, Derek Thompson argues that the exodus of people from the Scottish Highlands in search of work in English-speaking areas in the 19th century was a key factor in its eventual decline. And we can also see that due to migration for employment, we see that a lot of people who are speakers of tribal languages or minor languages, they shift from their mother tongues to Hindi to get employment in large North Indian cities. Economic factors thus counteracted the efforts of the Gaelic School Society to foster stable Gaelic English bilingualism. We can see the same type of economic factors apart from other factors like lack of institutional support, status, etc., involved in endangerment of tribal languages like Berhor, Gadaba, or Parji, etc. in India. Another important factor in language shift is demographic factor. Numbers of speakers do have a bearing on successful language maintenance. It might seem obvious that the smaller the size of a community, the stronger the threat of language shift and death. However, it is not possible to specify a critical mass of speakers necessary for the survival of a language. Matthias Brinzinger cites the case of Baiso, an Eastern Cushitic language of southern Ethiopia, which has resisted language replacement for 1,000 years, although the number of its speakers has always been small, in the region of around 500 in 1990, that was the count. Apart from absolute numbers or proportions of speakers of dominated language to dominating language, the distribution of speakers is of some significance. Enforced or de facto segregation of immigrant communities would appear to offer better chances of language maintenance, all other things being equal. When Lang Li found that third generation Chinese Americans residing in Chinese dominant neighborhoods, Chinatowns, were less likely to have adopted English as their mother tongue than their age mates outside the Chinatowns. For an immigrant group, endogamy, marriage restricted to within the group, will also improve chances of a family language being transmitted to offsprings. Another important factor in case of language shift is institutional support. Lack of institutional support can lead to language shift. The use of a minority language in education, religion, the media, or administration may assist attempts to bolster its position, but for minorities, this can only be done at great cost. There are limits to the extent to which a non-dominant immigrant language, or more usually languages, can be used in schools. A major asymmetry exists between use of a minority language in educational settings associated with formal and standard norms of a language, and the hyper-colloquial and localized use characteristic of a language in its dying stages. So, if a language is in dying stages, then in order to be able to use it for education or for other formal domains, it will have to be revived or even reconstructed. So, German was once a prominent language of the USA, not far behind English at the time of independence. Since then, it has declined as a colloquial language, with most speakers eventually shifting to English. German is, however, maintained until the present day among Old Order Amish and Mennonite communities in Pennsylvania, whose religious beliefs preclude them from participating in modern ways of dress, behavior, and speech. The institution of religion is the most significant factor here, though other factors like endogamy and resistance to economic and social change may also play a contributory role here in maintenance. Status is another very important factor. Some writers consider a group's self-esteem and the status of their language, oral or written, vehicle for sacred texts, major regional language elsewhere in the world, and so on, to play a role in maintenance or shift. These are not entirely separate from economic and class factors, however. Thus, Arabic is a high-status language in the Middle East, but not in Europe, where it is mainly connected with immigrant working class speakers and refugees. How speakers view their language and what status they give to it is important in deciding the fate of the language. Of course, it is related to the chances of growth, progress, and sense of worth that a language provides for its speakers. For example, Sami Fjord community in Norway took the drastic decision of preventing their children from learning Sami. And Yaku tribe of East Africa in 1930s gave up their language in face of social and economic pressure by taking up the language of Maasai tribe, as Yakus were hunter-gatherers and Maasais were cattle breeders and settlers. So the Maasais have a higher social status. Thus, the Yakus shifted from the Yaku language to the Maasai language, and there was also another reason. The reason is that after the more dominant group of Maasai moved into the traditional area of the Yaku, there was a gradual decline in endogamy among the Yaku, whereas traditionally Yaku girls received beehives as wedding gifts. When they began marrying Maasai men, they received livestock, that is cattle, instead. Soon Yaku parents began demanding this from Yaku men as well, necessitating a traumatic change in lifestyle for younger Yaku men. They had to acquire cattle by serving as herders for the Maasai. This brought them close to the Maasai in lifestyle, since pastoralism, keeping cattle, involved a more sedentary lifestyle than hunting and gathering. Marriage between Yaku men and Maasai women then became a possibility. Similarly, Aditi Mukherjee in her study conducted in Delhi found that Bengali is being maintained in more domains than Punjabi, as Bengalis accorded high status to their language, especially for literary and cultural traditions, compared to majority language of Delhi, Hindi, while Punjabis in Delhi accord their language a lower literary and cultural status than Hindi.